This is Harsh Rules. I'm Ben Harsh, and today we're going to learn to play The Last 100 Yards. The Last 100 Yards was released in 2019 by GMT Games and designed by Mike Denson. This game supports up to 2 players and takes from 1 to 3 hours to play. Before we begin this episode, I'd like to recognize the Harsh Rules Patreon supporters that help make content like this possible. If you'd like to support the channel, head over to patreon.com/harshrules to learn more. And once again, thank you for your support. Harsh Rules is partnering with Nightingale Games to support War Room, the 2nd edition on Kickstarter. If you missed the main campaign in June, don't worry, there's still an opportunity to order at a discounted price. And if you already own the 1st edition, you don't need to buy the entire game again. Post-launch, enhanced components like the redesigned morale board, the nano expansion, and other game upgrades will be available at the Nightingale Games web store. So don't miss out on War Room 2nd edition, and keep your eyes on this channel for a rules breakdown on the new quick battle system and other enhancements. Welcome back to the Harsh Rules breakdown for The Last 100 Yards. In this episode, we're going to look at vehicles and then anti-tank fire. So let's get started. In the base game, vehicles are motorized units consisting of armored fighting vehicles and carriers. Armored fighting vehicles, often abbreviated as AFVs, are fully armored, motorized vehicles consisting primarily of tanks, self-propelled guns such as tank destroyers, assault guns, and armored cars. Armored fighting vehicles are single-step combat units. An armored fighting vehicle can be easily identified because it will have both an armor value with a smaller armor enfilade value, in other words, a rear armor value, above it. They can also be differentiated from support vehicles in that they have platoon IDs in the bottom center of their counters. Carriers, on the other hand, are motorized vehicles used primarily for the transport of non-vehicular units. Tracked or half-track carriers are single-step combat units. Wheeled carriers, such as trucks, are zero-step non-combat units. All vehicles can transport units, but carriers are built for it and can hold more non-vehicular units as well as tow guns. For example, armored fighting vehicles and half-tracks can carry 2 steps of non-vehicular units. Trucks can carry 3 steps. They can also carry 1 platoon leader as well as a single light anti-tank weapon. Trucks have the option that instead of these, they may tow a gun. Stationary vehicles may load or unload riders or passengers as part of its maneuver at no additional movement point cost. However, riders or passengers cost their entire maneuver allowance when mounting or dismounting a vehicle. Next, let's take a closer look at each of these vehicle counter types. Let's begin with the armored fighting vehicle counter layout and discuss the anti-tank fire attributes linked to hard targets like vehicles. In earlier missions, we dealt exclusively with soft targets with a green cohesion rating. With the introduction of vehicles into scenarios, the yellow armor values will also need to be considered when conducting combat. Fortunately, the key to navigating this system is in the counter layout. The left side is reserved for offense, and the right side for defense. The offensive side of the counter shows that particular unit's capabilities with anti-tank, assault, and small arms. These values map directly to an opponent's defensive stats on the right side of their counter. This means that players will only need to match the appropriate offensive value to the correct defensive value. The color coding makes it easy. Green matches to green and yellow to yellow. Armored fighting vehicles have their own reduction path. Armored fighting vehicles begin at full strength. When they suffer a hit, the counter is flipped over to its shock side. This stage is very similar to disruption with non-vehicular units. Armored fighting vehicles can attempt recovery and return to full strength from a shock state. However, while in a shock state, if the armored fighting vehicle suffers a subsequent hit, It will be eliminated and recorded as a casualty. Now, let's take a look at other vehicle types and their reduction paths. Other vehicle types only have a single side to their counter. Combat vehicles, like a half-track, when they suffer a hit, the counter is removed and a casualty is recorded. However, non-combat vehicles like trucks, when they suffer a hit, their counter is removed, but players do not record them as a casualty. As a refresher from an earlier episode, there are two types of movement in the game. Non-vehicular units may use the minimum movement rule or the pay-to-enter movement rule. Vehicular units are limited to the pay-to-enter movement rule. The cost to enter a hex is based on the terrain and the type of vehicle being used. The cost can be found in the terrain effect table. Each vehicle type has a maneuver allowance. Armored fighting vehicles receive 5 movement points in activation, half-tracks 5 movement points, and trucks 6 movement points. In reaction, vehicles all receive 4 movement points. When playing a scenario with vehicles, it's important to understand the concept of motion. As a rule, vehicles are either in motion or stationary. To keep track of this status, players use colored motion markers. Green to indicate a vehicle is in motion, and red to indicate the vehicle has stopped. When a vehicle goes into motion, it costs 1 movement point. But stopping does not cost any movement points. Therefore, vehicles that maneuver into a different hex use the green motion marker, and if they stop in the current hex or maneuver to a different hex and stop, replace the green motion marker with a red motion marker. Combat vehicles may also conduct overwatch. This allows a vehicle to stop in the current or adjacent hex and maintain ability to fire, but in reaction only. This ability must be declared by the player and replace the motion marker with an overwatch marker. There are also 2 special maneuvers that can be employed. Halt and fire allows a vehicle in motion to stop and then shoot with a DRM penalty. The opposite of this is shoot and scoot, which allows a stationary vehicle to shoot and then maneuver with a DRM penalty. Next, let's look at some other special maneuvers unique to vehicles. In some cases, vehicles are allowed to maneuver through an enemy-occupied hex, either to bypass or overrun. However, a bypass or overrun maneuver is not allowed in a hex containing an assault nationality marker. First, let's discuss the bypass maneuver. A bypass allows any vehicle to maneuver through an enemy-occupied hex in an attempt to avoid combat. Armored fighting vehicles can always bypass. All other vehicles, as a last resort, may bypass provided there are no other eligible hexes the bypassing vehicle can enter. There is no additional movement point cost to conduct a bypass. Now, let's look at the procedural steps to conduct a bypass maneuver. First, the bypassing player declares the bypassing units in the hex being bypassed. Next, each bypassing vehicle, or stack of vehicles, maneuvers into the bypass hex and temporarily halts. Then, each undisputed non-shocked enemy unit in the bypass hex may immediately conduct anti-tank reaction fire, if they're capable, against a single bypassing vehicle, or small arms reaction fire against any riders. Please note that split fire is not allowed. And finally, once the bypass reaction fire is completed, the bypassing vehicles must exit the hex and complete their maneuver. Now, as you can see, bypassing is pretty straightforward. Overruns, on the other hand, are a little more complicated. Let's take a look. Another special maneuver with vehicles is being able to conduct an overrun. Vehicles with a small arms value or an anti-tank value may overrun an enemy-occupied hex provided that hex is in open terrain. An overrun costs 2 movement points to conduct. There is one exception to this. An armored fighting vehicle may overrun any enemy unit in an enclosed road hex provided it enters and exits the overrun hex along the road. Vehicles are limited to a single overrun per game turn and cannot overrun the same hex twice. In addition, a hex cannot be overrun more than once per game turn. With overruns, there are some restrictions. Players cannot conduct an overrun in hexes with a fortified position or armored fighting vehicles. And fighting vehicles and half-tracks cannot overrun a hex containing a towed gun, fighting vehicle, or half-track. And finally, overruns cannot be conducted if armored fighting vehicles are carrying riders or half-tracks are transporting towed guns. Now, let's walk through the procedural steps for conducting an overrun. First, the player conducting the overrun declares the overrunning units and the hex or units being overrun. A quick note, if overrunning with two vehicles, they must occupy the same hex at the beginning of their action. In step 2, each overrunning vehicle or stack of vehicles maneuvers into the overrun hex. Then they expend 2 movement points, 1 movement point for the hex and 1 for the overrun, and then temporarily halt. In step 3, enemy vehicles in the hex being overrun may immediately maneuver to avoid the overrun, but in doing so cannot shoot and scoot, halt and fire, conduct their own overrun, load or unload, or enter Overwatch. In step 4, it's time to conduct overrun fire. Each overrunning vehicle is limited to one of the following fire actions. For small arms fire, a small arms die roll modifier marker equal to the small arms value of the overrunning vehicle, less any terrain effects modifiers, is placed in the overrun hex. Or, with anti-tank fire, an unmodified 2 anti-tank die roll modifier marker is placed on a single towed gun or vehicle in the overrun hex if the overrunning vehicle is an armored fighting vehicle with an anti-tank value greater than or equal to 0. In step 5, it's time for overrun reaction fire. This occurs immediately and is limited to fire from units in the overrun hex against the overrunning vehicle depending on its type. If an armored fighting vehicle, overrun units with an anti-tank value greater than or equal to 0 and that have not conducted an action, must conduct anti-tank fire against a single armored fighting vehicle. Split fire is not allowed. Or, if there is no unit with an anti-tank value greater than or equal to 0, but the hex does contain a squad, then that single squad, as its sole action for that game turn, may attempt to shock a single armored fighting vehicle, with an unmodified die roll equal to 10. When handling overrun reaction fire with a fighting vehicle or a half-track, non-vehicular units excluding towed guns in the overrun hex with an anti-tank value may conduct anti-tank fire against a single fighting vehicle or half-track. And finally, once overrun reaction fire is completed, the overrunning vehicle or vehicles, unless destroyed or shocked, must exit the overrun hex and complete their maneuver. And now that we've covered maneuvers, let's look at how anti-tank fire works. The game mechanics for anti-tank fire are very similar to small arms fire. In the action phase for anti-tank fire attacks, players assign yellow DRM markers to targets that are then resolved in the fire resolution phase. In this example, first the U.S. Armored Fighting Vehicle in M4A3 establishes line of sight to the German Armored Fighting Vehicle in STUH-105 to confirm it is an eligible target. Next, players reference the anti-tank fire die roll modifier table to calculate the DRM for this attack. The U.S. unit has an anti-tank fire value of 3, which is our first modifier for the calculation. The range of this unit is 21, so we find the 21 column on the anti-tank fire DRM table, and this is compared to the actual distance to the target, which is 5. With this unit's greater range and close proximity to the target, there are no further modifiers for the calculation. Therefore, we assign a yellow 3 DRM marker to the target. If the shot is passing through the enemy unit's rear arc, then this would be considered enfilade fire and would be marked with a yellow 3DRM marker with an E. In the last 100 yards, there are no facing indicators printed on the counters. Therefore, enfilade, also known as attacks to a unit's rear, are determined by fire that enters a defending unit's hex through its rear arc. A unit's frontal and rear arcs are established the moment a unit fires or receives fire, or in the case of a maneuvering armored fighting vehicle, the last hex side it crossed. It's important to note that the line dividing the frontal and rear arcs is considered part of the frontal arc. Once the frontal and rear arcs are established, all reaction fire in that reaction segment through the defending unit's rear arc is considered enfilade fire. The firing player must declare any enfilade fire and the firing units involved. In an exposed position, a vehicle may maneuver in reverse to avoid enfilade fire. The player must announce a reverse maneuver at the beginning of a vehicle's activation or reaction. Be aware, though, vehicles cannot combine forward and reverse maneuvers, nor can they bypass or overrun during a reverse maneuver. Now, when a unit is marked with an anti-tank die roll modifier marker, the following rules are in effect. First, vehicles and tow guns may conduct normal actions. However, vehicles that subsequently maneuver into another hex carry those anti-tank die roll modifier markers with them. Remember that enfiladed vehicles are marked with an anti-tank die roll modifier marker containing a subscript E. And when conducting multiple anti-tank fire actions against two enemy armored fighting vehicles in the same hex, the anti-tank fire actions must be distributed equally amongst the two armored fighting vehicles if possible. Later, during the fire resolution phase, to resolve this anti-tank fire attack, we merely roll a 10-sided die and modify the result with a 3 as printed on the marker. This final fire attack result is then compared to the unit's armor rating. In an enfilade attack scenario, the armor enfilade number above this is used. If the final fire attack result is from 1 to 7, it is within the German unit's armor rating and has no effect. However, a die result of 8 will shock the unit and flip it over. A subsequent hit while it's on its shock side will result in a casualty. If the die result is 9 or higher, the German unit is destroyed and a casualty is recorded. Be aware that there is no effect if the unmodified die roll is equal to 1. And as you've no doubt noticed, much of these mechanics are very similar to small arms fire. So if you've already mastered small arms fire, learning these anti-tank fire rules should be fairly straightforward. And now that we've covered vehicles and anti-tank fire, you should be ready to play more missions in the last 100 yards. If you found this video helpful, please give me a like and share with your friends. To be the first notified when the next episode of Harsh Rules becomes available, please hit the bell icon for notifications. And as always, this has been Harsh for Harsh Rules. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you on the next video.